next talk is all about getting new customers engaged with your product. It's presented by Colin Bentley. He's a Group Product Manager at Intercom. He has a background as a designer, and as I mentioned already, he was our first product manager that we hired. Colin will now talk a bit more about onboarding and how we think about it at Intercom.
Hey everyone. So Intercom is used by thousands of customers to help them onboard their new users every day. So we think about onboarding a lot. And today, I want to share some of the ways that we think about onboarding in Intercom that will help you do a better job of it. So first, what is onboarding? I think of this as the job of onboarding is assisting new users to understand and experience how your product is going to help them achieve their goal. It's about unwrapping that value and showing how your solution is the answer to the motivation that drove them to your product in the first place. And this matters. I think this graph does a great representation of it. I'd wager that this is a typical user retention graph for most apps out there. 100 people show up on day one, you lost half of them by day two, and you continue to hemorrhage users every day after that. And this is all in the context of the huge amount of time, money, and effort that you're spending to get people to sign up for your app and for your product in the first place. Whether that's a beautiful website, lots of effort on the blog, paying direct advertising, you're putting huge effort on that side of the house. So it's crazy that you don't then try and make sure that those new users who have arrived are set up in the best way possible to succeed. So today, I'm going to talk about some ways of how to think about onboarding through different lenses. And it should help ensure that the people who do show up at your door stick around for longer and become active, happy, successful customers. As I talk through these items, I'm also going to use a fictional project management product to help show how some of these ways thinking can be used in practice. So first up, how to think about success. And I think as product builders and immersed in building a product out every day, it's really easy for us to think of our product as a set of features and functions. And so when we come to think about onboarding, we think of successful onboarding as a new user who comes and takes the actions, creates a project, starts a to-do list, assigns a task in their first few days. Looks really good. But I think that Ryan Singer really points out some of the weaknesses that are here. As product builders, it's just much easier for us to explain our mechanisms to new users, and that's why we end up doing it. But that's not really thinking from the user's point of view. Why have they signed up to your product? What are they trying to achieve in using your product? If we think of our project management example again, their goal for a user is not to create a to-do list. It's to deliver a project on time, under budget, please their boss, be able to cut that ribbon. And when you think of it in this framework, onboarding becomes much less about how can I get a new user to use feature X, and much more about how can I show how my product can help new users achieve their final outcome, their desired outcome. To summarize this, I love Kathy Sierra's angle on product building in general and onboarding as well, of how all of that job is to try and, when you do these activities, you're trying to turn your users into superheroes. That angle of thinking about how you can enable your user is so much better than thinking about your product and the tools that are inside it. Another layer or angle for us to think about onboarding is to think about the job. So Jeff mentioned the jobs to be done framework, something we use a lot in Intercom, and something I think we can apply really well here to onboarding as well. So the question that this prompts to me is, do you know why people are coming to your product? What's the motivation that's driving them? What's the need that's driving them to sign up for your product in the first place? So something we recommend to all our customers is to go and ask them. Go and understand why new users are coming to your product, what are the needs they're trying to fulfill, and you'll just have a much better sense of how you can then try and help that customer see the value in their product. As more and more of that data comes in, you'll start seeing patterns. And you'll start seeing groups of really definitive jobs or needs by why people are driving to them. And if you can find patterns of behavior within those people who are answering a similar way, you're now starting to be able to segment based on what your users are trying to do when they first show up. And that's a really great seed or genesis for creating specific onboarding to serve and show how your product can solve that problem. Next up, how to think about the context. And this is trying to take a little bit of a wider lens here. Sometimes you get very focused on onboarding and the messages that are there. But when you widen that out and you think about your customers and what they're going through when they're in this onboarding phase, is they're actually making a switch from an old way that they solved this problem to now trying your application as a new way of doing it. And our jobs to be done gives us a great model that we can work here called the forces model, which describes a user as they're during this switching phase of moving from a current solution to a new product. And there are these forces that are encouraging them to make that switch. And at the same time, there are a set of forces that are interacting and pushing them back towards their old way of doing things. I think this is a lovely layer to think about onboarding because it adds some context around what the person is trying to achieve. And the job of onboarding is trying to maximize those push and pull forces. So again, to make that a little bit more concrete, here we have a message for our example project management app. We're trying to encourage teammates. And part of the message, we start to flesh out the pains of the old way of doing things, these long mail trails, while at the same time talking about the benefits of the new solution, a one shared space that's always up to date. So it's just adding context into what you're trying to get the customer to do. At the same time as maximizing those push forces, you're also trying to minimize the forces that are pulling people back to their old solution. And as we saw from that graph of user retention, that's actually a really common thing. People end up going back to what they always did before. So again, an example message here, you might be trying to show a customer in their first days about how easy it is to get started. Reduce that anxiety about making the switch and allowing them to import via whatever file type they use right now. At the same time, you might be eating away at habits that they do right now, like sending a weekly message and saying, hey, we do that automatically. You don't have to worry about it anymore. So I think the four forces model can offer a great holistic rounding or context of the messages you're trying to write and how you're trying to communicate with your customer. Next layer or lens I think about is around the medium. And I think this is like a nice illustration of how onboarding has evolved over the last while. Onboarding originally in its most basic form was a user manual. Big tome that arrived beside your piece of software, had no sense of the software itself, was delivered in all one big bang, and didn't relate to how you used your product at all. Things get a little bit better. We see context being used here. And context is an interesting thing to think about. How can you bridge the gap between separate manual and software and start bringing the actual onboarding into the customer experience? I think the product tours are a great definition of this era, which are great, but at the same time, they're usually delivered the very first time you use the product. And that's not really how you learn a product. So next, think about time. So users, as I said, don't learn in this one first-off use of your product. That's done much more over time. You learn it, you use it, you take us more bite-sized chunks of information. And that's a much better way to actually match learning patterns of how your customer is going to onboard and use your product. So I think drip campaigns are the definition here. We see a message sending on day 1, day 15, day 30. But they really struggle to understand and adapt how different customers will adopt your product in different ways. This schedule might make total sense for one user, but another user could have taken all these activities by day 5, and the rest of the messages you send aren't relevant. So the next layer down again is to think about behavior. How are new users using our product, and how can we use that to further optimize our onboarding? Here we're able to set up messages based on actions that customers take or don't take with your product. And this is quite powerful now. You're sending messages that are much more relevant to customers, and you're also creating some sort of adaptive nature in your onboarding, where it isn't a one-size-fits-all, and it starts to adapt much more naturally to how each different user would use it. So when you're thinking about your onboarding, I try and think of these mediums and using them all to their full potential: context, time, and behavior. That brings us to the next point, which is how to think about the schedule. Now, there's a really interesting thing that's happening here. The last slides I talked about were all about how we can enrich the onboarding, offer more tailored scenario, and particularly behavior-based messaging. When you look at it in a single message, it actually is quite simple. You've got a message here of an action that a customer has not taken, and we're going to send them a message based on that. But as you start to add more behaviors, as you start to encourage and get more sophisticated with your onboarding, you're starting to create this series and sets of messages that are really hard to understand how they're going to send. And that's essentially because you've created this three-dimensional space. Oh, sorry, not three-dimensional, n-dimensional space. Time being one dimension, and then every new behavior that you add adds another dimension. And that's impossible for people to hold in their head. They can't see how these things can sound, how they can relate to each other. So what does everyone do? They get their pen and paper out, and they start drawing it. They start trying to visualize what could be the possible different customer journeys, the possible different messages that could be received in different orders. And that's good at the start, especially when you have a relatively small amount of behaviors and small amount of messages. But as soon as you add any sort of level of complexity, for example, this is like a simple series of 6 behavior-based messages, and this is how complex the decision tree gets. That way of visualizing starts to break down. Now you've got this hard-coded set. Want to add another message in there? Want to change your products in some way? You're stuck. It becomes hugely actually difficult to think about adding more behavior or anything like that. So at Intercom, we actually try and think about messaging scheduling in a different way, and I'll talk you through how we think about it. The first is we all collapse those dimensions back down to time. Time is the easiest one you can relate to how a customer is going to experience your messages. The next thing we do is try and define a frequency of the frequency by which we want to message customers. Here's an example where we're going to message them, say, every 3rd day. And then we build all our time, behavior messages that are very specific, very targeted on those behaviors. And now rather than trying to connect dependencies or direct relationships between each of the messages, these are just ordered in a simple priority from top to bottom. So how does it work? New user comes along. They now match. We see that they match 3 of those messages, and we send the highest priority message. That's great. They've got a message. Wait a few more days. The next messaging opportunity comes up. We again check to see what messages they match at this point, what behaviors are relevant for them, and again, we send the highest priority message. And that process continues. So again, we check your messages and send it this way. So this allows 2 things. One is that you can get much richer and more specific about your targeting and the messages you're creating based on behavior. That priority list can just go all the way down, and you just reorder the priority as you need to. The second thing we're doing here is that it's now actually adapting to how each individual user might use the product. And without having to create these crazy trees, we're able to adapt to it. This is a way we've been thinking about onboarding for a while. It's a problem we've been tackling for a long time. And it's something that we're going to be excited to announce in the next few weeks. So anyone who uses Engage, I'll be really looking forward to hear how you get on with it. So we've chatted about a few different things. Let me leave you with some takeaways. First, and most importantly, I think, is thinking about success from your user's point of view. How can you help define your product and your onboarding to help that user achieve their outcome, not show them a set of tools? Try and understand your user's motivations for signing up for your product in the first place. This will be great for actually building the product, but also starting to tailor specific onboarding to solve those different segments who come with those different jobs. Be rich with your onboarding. Use context, time, and behavior as much as you can. And finally, to avoid this limiting effect, try and build some flexibility into your messaging schedule. There's no way you'll be able to match every customer journey. Thanks.